And then there's Jem Otis from Alabama. Like I said, yeah, Alabama might pick and choose a handful of whoever they want or the upper blue bloods, but they also have people who are leaving. Otis goes to Colorado. He was the number 1 ranked player in the portal defensively by ESPN. Max Olson made some comments about him, how disruptive he can be inside the interior line. His bio at Alabama, including for this year, powerful presence on the interior of Alabama's defensive line, battled injuries last year but back to full strength. And, of course, Alabama has a bowl game coming up against Michigan, but Otis is headed to play for Deion.
Yeah, well, when you have that many 4- and 5-star type guys, I mean, they still got to be able to play too, and there's only so many positions on the field, so it's just natural that Alabama, like everybody else in this day and age, is going to have attrition. It's just that some of theirs is going to be a bit more highly rated than a lot of other people's. And in this case, I think their loss is definitely Colorado's gain. I mean, the number 1 defensive prospect, as I mentioned there on that graphic, certainly we'll take that. 5-star coming out of high school, number 10 player in his class on the line, and played quite a bit for Alabama. So not a guy who's coming in who hasn't really seen much action, but he's played in a couple seasons worth of games and been somewhat productive. They lost a lot of guys, Colorado that is, to the portal. We know they took a big stride forward last season with Robert Livingston in that defense, and I've been curious of just what it's going to look like in the post-Shedeur Sanders, post-Travis Hunter type of world in general up there in Boulder. But Deion kind of gave his affirmation that he'll be back next year, and that allows you to get the ball rolling. And I think this is a sign of the types of guys they'll be able to reel in. And so this seems like a very big pickup, both literally and figuratively. And, the number 1 defensive player in the portal, and that's a great get. And there's belief in that defense and what they can do after what we saw last season. So I think of the storylines that I'm excited to see this offseason, and there are a lot of them, but how Colorado shifts without having Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter right there next to Deion, and how he builds a program without those guys, I'm very interested in, and they're off to a nice start, obviously.
A couple of notes that came down this afternoon. Baylor picked up a receiver, Kobe Prentice. He was once ranked among a top 100 recruit, went to Alabama, had some pretty good numbers. I looked at his numbers the last couple of years, 22, 23, also this year. Overall, 60 catches, 780 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Not great, but still among that room at Alabama, of course, which has unbelievable talent. This year, though, did not do much. He had 129 yards on 17, how many catches? Just a handful of catches and a touchdown. He is headed to play for Dave Aranda, Jake Spavital offense at Baylor.
Yeah, he's a guy who was a 4-star rated prospect coming out of high school in Alabama, and very highly coveted prospect at that time. His stars dimmed a bit since then. A 3-star in the transfer portal when they do these re-rankings, which is always interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see. And so take those for what you will, but still the same guy with the same level of talent by most estimations, just hasn't maybe panned out the way that he was projected to, but he'll have an opportunity to change that narrative next year. They needed help at wide receiver. He was the first of 2 commits today for them as they get to a handful in the transfer portal when it comes to additions, and they need wide receiver help in particular. It's in the slot, and he's a guy who I think will give them an instant impact and hopefully be able to flourish in this Jake Spavital offense like a lot of other receivers were able to do a year ago. I hope he can maximize those talents, and if he can, then this guy was pretty highly rated, as we mentioned, and maybe they got themselves a little bit of a steal here. But either way, they needed to address wide receiver with the guys that they'll be losing, so this is a step towards that.
You hear about some of the schools like Rhett Lashley today. We'll have a quote from him in a moment about SMU, or even what you hear from Jeff Traylor and G.J. Kinney down south at Texas State, UTSA, or schools around the country, Washington State, Jake Dickert. They're getting rated. But so are the other schools at the top who might be rating other schools, but letting others move on because they're not getting playing time. Fresno State linebacker Phoenix Jackson has committed to Baylor. Apparently it was between Baylor and Auburn. 365, Sikkim 365, .com had that earlier. Pretty disruptive player. 7 tackles behind the line of scrimmage and 4 sacks, a couple of picks, pass breakups, forced a fumble or 2, and he is headed to Baylor to play in that defense with Dave Aranda.
Yeah, they need linebacker help as well. It's another position where they're going to be losing a lot of guys. You do have a Keaton Thomas coming back, but obviously linebacker positions vary. So you've got one held down by Keaton Thomas, but you're going to be losing a guy like Matt Jones, among others. So that's another position of need, or a position group of need, and I think they hit 2 very important ones up today. So I don't know much about Phoenix Jackson outside of what you just mentioned there, but it seemed to be a prospect that they were high on and went after pretty quickly. So dig the name Phoenix. That's a cool first name.
Yep.
But yeah,
he ought to be playing for Arizona State.
Well, knowing what his options were, but yeah, he'll make the journey on over from Fresno State, and another position of need, like I said. So I don't know, with a lot of these portal guys, like, everybody's happy right now. You know what I mean? Like, every school in America is like, dude, we're killing it. And maybe there's some where they haven't got off to a good start where they don't feel that way. But, like, I don't think anybody's complained about the guys that they're bringing in. It's just so hard to tell in the chaos of people moving back and forth. You're just kind of accumulating. And it all tastes good initially. I don't know what it's going to be like on the other, you know what I mean? Like, on the other end. But right now, I guess if you're picking up guys, you're feeling good about it, and so they picked up a couple today, and they came at positions where they definitely need some numbers help. So, yeah, we'll see what Phoenix Jackson's capable of doing, but he was pretty productive a year ago.
Wait for some of the quotes that I'll read from others about where we are in college football, which I know you and Paul talked about. Paul should be back with us tomorrow, how you guys talked about it on Monday. All right, so then there's the Utah quarterback situation, which has been quite the drama. Almost a soap opera, and I'm not using that in a negative way, but there have been times it's been exhausting, I'm sure, for even Coach Whittingham, among others, like Cam Rising, Isaac Wilson. There was the thought he was going to leave. Now he says, no, I'm staying here. Utah, man, I am. Let's run it back. So Utah will have Isaac Wilson come back for one more year.
Utah, man, am I?
What did I say? Oh, I am. Okay. All right.
Utah,
it wasn't
man,
that much of a reason to correct me or anything.
Well, I mean, it's what he said.
I'm dyslexic.
it's probably the reason he said it that way as well, because it goes with being the Utah man. So want to get that right. But I should mention as well with Otis, Warren Sapp, as an assistant coach there in Colorado. I think he probably had a lot to do with bringing Otis in as well, and he seems to be doing a good job there with that defensive front. So I need to give him a mention as well. But, yeah, Utah man am I. There was a big question mark at that quarterback position, and obviously Utah addressed that somewhat last week with Devin Dampier. But Isaac Wilson, for as much as it may seem, because you saw him a lot this year, like he's a veteran quarterback, he is very much a young quarterback. He doesn't necessarily even need to be starting as much as he was and playing as much as he was out of the gates. That was just a result of the Cam Rising injury. So he got to see a lot more of the fire than I think he or Kyle Whittingham and anybody else expected to. And it didn't go all that well overall. You definitely probably had more bad than good, but there was definitely some good there and some reasons to believe he can be a good quarterback. So I think to get him back in the fold and to have him competing and filling out that room with guys like Devin Dampier just makes Utah stronger. And now you know what you've got in him. And so if, God forbid, something happens to Dampier, and I'm sure those guys will compete, but you know what you've got in your backup quarterback there with Isaac Wilson, who you'd imagine will just naturally and should be better based on getting a lot of playing time this season. So I don't know what his offers were like out of the portal, but clearly he either loved what he heard from the new OC and Jason Beck and what was laid out, or just maybe didn't love what he saw in the portal. But either way, I think it's a good thing for Utah and their program to get him back in the fold.
One thing you wonder about, if a player commits to transfer, like at this time, maybe even signs something, and then all of a sudden somebody that was on the roster who thought they thought was leaving because that's why they wanted to go there, that person stays. Do they change their mind again, or can they? I don't know. Joseph Manjek, real physical player, University of Houston wide receiver. According to Matt Zenitz, who does a great job with a lot of this coaching news too, is headed to transfer to TCU.
Yeah, he's a really talented player, really good player. That's a tough loss for Houston, who's been dealt some blows when it comes to their receivers these last couple of portal cycles. Did not have the biggest year this year, and I think obviously had some injuries and whatnot involved in that. Mostly just the fact that their offense sucked and they could not throw the ball very well was probably the biggest reason for Manjack not having a more productive season. But he's a talented player and just never really got it going this year for whatever reason that you want to point to. So I can understand wanting to kind of explore your options and see if there's not something better out there. TCU's been very much a team that's been active in picking up some pretty good wide receiver prospects these last couple of years, and we saw what Jack Beck went and did there this past season. So I think that there's definitely opportunity that you can see and feel and watch on film if you're a wide receiver prospect there with TCU that you don't necessarily feel as confident in with what Houston's got going on, even though they've made changes on offense to try and correct that. So, I think that's a really good pickup for TCU. We'll see, how involved he is and what the rest of that room looks like. But I like that for them a lot and thought he would be a good pickup once he kind of made it known that he might be out there. I thought that he was going to be a really good get for somebody, so it just turns out to be the Frogs, and maybe he'll get to see his team again next year. I don't know what TCU's 2025 schedule looks like in terms of Houston being on there or not, but that's a good get.
Dabo Swinney is on the streets and loose. Signed his first transfer portal. Tristan Smith played at Southeast Missouri State, put up some big numbers. Also was at Hutchinson Community College before he went into college. 76 catches a year ago, nearly 950 yards and 6 scores, and also had a pretty big game in the first playoff game against Illinois State in the FCS playoffs. So Clemson has popped the bubble when it comes to getting in the transfer portal. I think you'll see maybe a small handful. He is the first.
He's the first non-quarterback.
Yeah,
they've hit the transfer portal and gotten quarterbacks before, but he's the first non-quarterback that they've signed. So that's kind of ridiculous that we've gotten this far into the portal era, and that's been the case with Clemson. It's also kind of ridiculous they've managed to have as much success as they've had despite not really dipping in there. So as much flack as Dabo's received for that, and rightfully so, he's also been able to kind of throw it back at people, as ACC champion and in the playoff, after all the talk about him needing to change his ways and all that, here they are again. They're still playing for a national title. But, that's going to be a cool footnote for the updated Trivial Pursuit Clemson Football Edition. That'll be a great trivia question for the Clemson fans and college football fans out there. Who was Dabo's first non-quarterback transfer pickup? That's a cool little footnote in history, and we'll see how far they take it. But I think it's a good sign and a welcome sign if you're a Clemson fan to see them start to spread their wings a little bit.
I want to get to a couple of quotes from coaches, but there's two more names. We'll get through the transfer players, and sometimes we'll start with coaching carousel, and sometimes we'll start with whatever news there is or games, etc. in college football. But Puffenberger, Reese Puffenberger from Albany, is committed to North Texas. There he is. He threw for 3,600 yards, 36 touchdowns, very prolific in the FCS. He now is went to Miami, and then, of course, Albany, and now headed to North Texas because Morris is headed to Virginia.
Yeah, it seems like a nice pickup for North Texas. They had a pretty productive offense this past year, productive enough that Chandler Morris decided to take his ball and go head back into the portal for the third time. Ridiculous, but regardless, Reese Puffenberger, well-traveled in his own right, clearly, as you point out there. So, I think North Texas, as much as it's going to be tough to retain some of their original guys that break out and become good players, they will always be a solid landing spot for guys like a Reese Puffenberger who's maybe on his second or third stop, and they've proven that they can, produce numbers at the quarterback position. So it seems like a solid pickup from where I sit. But, the Chandler Morris thing had me a little riled up yesterday just because it just speaks to sort of the environment that we're in. And some love it, some hate it. I fall somewhere in between. It depends on what we're talking about specifically. But you can't sit there and bitch about it too much if you're North Texas and turn around and go get a guy who's on his third school. So, you lose guys, you gain guys. That's just the environment we're in, and good for the Mean Green to go and address a position of need.
Gary, we'll skip the one next, the next quarterback. We'll bring that up a little bit later. I want to get to this quote from Rhett Lashley. Of course, they're in the college football playoff and playing this weekend. People are bombarding our roster, trying to pick off our roster, and we're trying to focus on the playoff game. I'm not going to be old man, get off my lawn. I thought about this a lot when I was driving to East Texas and back, into Tyler and back. And it's not get off my lawn. The NCAA created this because they waited too long. We've been through that. Everyone has an opinion on that. The freedom of movement, whatever. But I started thinking, I was listening to the podcast, and I'm like, what's going on here? Like, this is truly, as UT Parking said in the chat, off the rails. Some people would argue that, no, this is fair. I don't know what's good or bad, but that's from Rhett Lashley as they're preparing to play in the college football playoff, where like the backup quarterback at Penn State is going to transfer. It's like the timeline of, did people with brains get into a meeting and go, hey, you do know some of this is going to cross over. Shouldn't we look at this first, or are they just scared of lawsuits? But there's Rhett Lashley getting ready for their opening playoff game.
Well, I mean, I don't even know if they're scared of lawsuits at this point. Those are just automatic losses. So I don't know if you're even scared because you've taken so many on the chin that you already know the outcome, basically. And so I don't know, it's scary to get served lawsuits anymore because you already know the outcome and all that. But I do think as much as the chaos can be fun, like, for example, you're sitting here today, and if you're a fan of any number of teams, you picked up a commit today, or there's a transfer portal guy you're after. Like, that's exciting. You also may be on the other side talking about the guy you just lost in the transfer portal. Maybe that was a good subtraction. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. There's the coaching carousel. West Virginia fans are fired up. They probably hope they're one of those teams picking off some of those SMU players. Like, the chaos can be fun depending on what side of the table you're sitting on. It can also be exhausting no matter where you're sitting because it just seems never ending. And this was a situation entirely created by college football's leaders who decided to be as greedy as possible until the courts told them that they couldn't take any more money without there being some legal repercussions. And then they proceeded to find ways to still make as much money as they always did, but pull the extra money now needed from other places. And the greed led us here. But for all the talk about guardrails and all of that, I think the biggest problem is you're trying to be a professional sport and you're acting as though school's getting in the way when you're a school and the football's the secondary. And I know that's not the case. And like my school, like I'm not trying to get an argument about the importance and all of that, but these schools, first and foremost, is what they are, right, are having a problem because school's getting in the way of their football programs' timelines. And I don't know how you correct that. You can't adjust semesters to comply with football and whether or not that program makes the college football playoffs, so their calendar's different that year as compared to other years. So it's messy. It's definitely not going to be cleaned up anytime relatively soon. And I don't know how it gets cleaned up. I don't have the solutions to that, but the officials, in charge of the game led to this with their stubbornness and their greed and their inability to try and cut this off at the head, even though they had plenty of warnings that this was coming. So, it is what it is, and you're just going to wade through the muck as a fan and hopefully get to another side here sooner rather than later where it's a bit cleaned up, because I don't think the way it is now is sustainable in terms of maintaining an audience for years to come. Like, I think you have your hardcores that are going to be on board with changes, but I don't think you can do this for another 5 years of just chaos and everybody who's always been on board is going to remain on board.
Well, I love college football.